that? Hey. Hey, so it's gonna be right here?
Nah, you're gonna sit right here.
I will put it right there.
How do you record it?
It's going.
Oh, sick. What's good?
It'll be the new chair falling.
Yo, delete that part.
Oh my god. Hey guys, you're on your most professional behavior, right? Great.
I forgot it was today, and I just.
What would you have worn differently? A blazer?
Or jeans.
Like
a sweater.
My brother's class at UCD.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How'd your brother feel about that? What high school was he from?
I'm not sure. He was in the news a lot.
Are we gonna like?
Those guys are cool.
Yeah.
We're not doing that.
Ours?
Yeah, let's do it.
Ours is not. Hey, his
Should we do an
basketball
icebreaker?
card.
Yeah. Oh, he's an
Oh.
instant.
Should we do the rock, paper, scissors? Oh, that
Hey,
one.
get
Yeah, let them do
Oh, that
No, 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 no. I was gonna say like
Christian.
choose for Larissa. We won't do it twice. 'Cause
Christian, you're.
Okay, makes sense.
we're all here. What back?
Oh, I heard
I
the
said
door.
Christian.
Okay.
Is everyone taking notes? Everyone has something to take notes on?
Can we just use this?
It's kind of weird, like.
writing on it.
It's kind of weird having her like article.
Yeah, you can, but there's writing on the back. I don't know how you're gonna get quotes.
No, wait, that's mine. You have two. Then give me the other folded one. Jesus.
It's because of this anticipation.
Yeah, it really is. And also, it's like Nick went to go get them.
I'm kind of really stressed right now.
I just wanted to give like a fun first impression.
Okay,
But like,
I think Nick's
We
gives
don't
the
want
wrong
her
impression.
to like
but
run
no,
out.
Chloe, you're nice
Oh,
to
yeah.
everyone. Like Nick is just. Am I
Nick.
though?
yeah.
Okay, thanks, but.
He knows we're talking about him too.
No.
Yeah, I probably do.
You guys are being recorded, by the way.
Right now?
Yeah.
No.
You want me to remark on that? You just-
Nah, it's already. This is Christian.
Just stop it till I get here.
No. you need
I
that.
don't know how to do that.
This reminds me, there's this hilarious video called Gotta Get That B-Roll.
Oh, and it's in
I've
slow
literally
motion.
dropped my glasses 6 times.
Christian.
It's not. It's only because it was in the video, and I didn't even look. I was just
Yeah,
in
you
the
were
video
looking at
app, and it was
glasses.
slow motion.
I don't want to go glasses.
This
See
kid.
any of our faces in the mosaic video? No. Exactly.
You could have sped it up. It might have messed up the
I
sound.
know you're gonna say.
You were funny today.
Oh, and oh yeah.
So was the point of that video is he
But you were.
like is in a Twilight Zone sort of thing and he keeps locking himself in the closet and then he can't get out?
What the
I think so.
No, yeah, that's an
Yeah.
intense video. That's like.
Bad situation.
That had me thinking, like, I was watching that
Is
video.
that the point of it?
Yeah.
There's some really good ones and some ones I was just like, what?
Like
the-
mine. Yeah. That was about.
No, there was literally like a 20 minute, like literally 20 minutes of them like chopping it, and I was like,
Justin?
The one with the
Seems like something
burritos?
Justin.
oh, Jesus.
Team basis.
Hi. Where's that bottle?
Okay, you guys are gonna come sit right over here. Thanks for coming, guys.
No, it's worked out fine. We weren't sure time how to get here, where to park.
Yeah, we have a silent reading that we have to do. No problem. Okay. Thanks for coming. Do you want us to start by introducing ourselves? Or
Yeah.
do you want to introduce yourself? What do you
A
want
lot
to
of
do?
names.
Yeah, we're gonna act so you remember all of our names.
Yes, well, I'm very bad at that, but I will try. I don't know, how do you,
We'll introduce ourselves and let's just say maybe your grade, your role on the paper, and why you wanted to take journalism in the first place. Let's start with Sarah.
I'm Sarah. I'm a senior. I'm co-editor-in-chief, and I took journalism because I wanted to be with Olivia in this class. That's actually why I took journalism.
an honest answer?
I'm Olivia. I'm a senior. I'm co-editor-in-chief with Sarah, and I took this class because I like writing.
I'm Aaron. I'm a junior. I'm the online and social media editor, and I took this class because I like reading the news and I wanted to write something.
I'm Chloe. I'm a junior, and I'm
Travis. I'm a sophomore, and I chose to take this class because I guess I'm interested in writing, and I also wanted to ditch a certain class I wasn't doing particularly well in. So, yeah.
Very honest answers.
I'm Kenna, I'm a junior, and I'm a reporter, and I took this because I wanted a chance to write, like, outside of English class about something I cared about.
I'm Kira, I'm a senior, I'm a photography editor. I took this class freshman year because I really wanted to be able to write the ones that would be cool.
I'm Yelda, I'm a senior and I'm a TA, and I decided to be a TA because I like to help out.
What's a TA? Okay.
I'm Daniela, I'm a freshman and a staff writer for the Woodside World, and I took journalism because I really enjoy writing.
I'm Kiki, I'm the sports reporter for Woodside World. I'm a sophomore, and I took journalism because I really enjoy writing.
I'm Christian, I'm a junior, I'm the video editor, and I took journalism because I like meeting people, I like talking to people, interviewing them. Journalism is great for that.
That is true.
I'm Stefan, I'm the politics editor, I'm also junior, and I think I joined journalism mainly because I have an aunt who works for Reuters, and that really encouraged me to join up.
I'm Bree, I'm a staff writer, and I'm a sophomore, and I thought to take this class because I think it would be interesting for me.
I'm Nick, you met me earlier.
I did.
I'm the opinion editor. I'm also a staff writer. The reason I joined journalism was really just because, as my editor position suggests, I'm really opinionated. But I have a lot of ideas about what's going on in the world around us, and I really just want to kind of get that onto paper, what I see onto paper. So that's why to kind of embody that. Yeah.
I'm Stella, I'm a freshman, I'm a staff writer, and I joined journalism because it was the second best thing next to photography.
Thanks.
Don't worry, I still like this
okay.
class.
I'm Zach, I'm a junior, and then I'm the entertainment editor, and the reason I joined journalism was because, I kind of want to, get my opinions heard and, out there, and then, as I started to do it more, because, I started it last year, I kind of got, into the whole, process and, just, doing news writing and, features and all that, so.
I'm Beck, I'm a junior, I'm the sports editor, and I really like reading news, so I figured why not write it.
Good point. I'm Larissa, and it's interesting that you, Christian, are the only one who mentioned meeting people, because I think I also got into journalism for the reason that all the rest of you, or many of the rest of you mentioned, which is I used to like to write. And I, like many people who like to write, thought first of fiction, and then became attracted to nonfiction because of the meeting people. It's an incredibly fun profession because you have the freedom not only to meet people and learn about many different things. You don't have to stay in one narrow specialty as you do in some jobs, but also you have the freedom to ask people all kinds of probing questions that might be you might be too shy to ask or feel might be impolite to ask in many social situations, but in an interview you can just go right in. They've said, yes, okay, you can write about me, and you can ask people anything, and that is very exciting to be able to go right to the heart of someone right away, not to have to just make small talk all the time. Interviews are very intense, or they can be sometimes if people are willing to go there with you, and that's one of the things I love that part of it as much as I love the writing, and so I'm really glad you brought that up, and that's what I want to talk more about later, but I don't know how you want to
do you want to
structure
also
the
introduce
class.
yourself?
Oh, sure. I'm Joni, and I'm not a writer, but I work at the Center for Ethics and Society at Stanford, and we brought Larissa out a couple of years, and usually she's talking to our Stanford seniors that are writing theses. And this year we thought it would be fun to come and meet some high school students and hear what's going on at the high school level and have some conversations. So look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Cool. So thank you for connecting us with Larissa. We're really excited. So we most recently read your Building a Prison to School Pipeline article. And so if you wanna just tell us a little bit of background about that, that can maybe kick us off, and then they have a ton of questions that they have ready for you.
To be honest, I mean, usually the way I get.
Larissa, sorry, really quick.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
So we're doing a project about like you coming and talking, and we were recording it. So I was wondering if that was okay with you.
Thank you for asking. No, I appreciate that, because actually something I've noticed with younger people now is that the default assumption seems to be that everything's on the record, that nothing is private, because I'll go to talk to a college class or something and people will just tweet or post things that I said without asking my permission, and now I'm used to that, and I know that that's the default assumption, but I don't think it necessarily should be, and I really appreciate your asking. So, I mean, can I just tell just a quick story to illustrate what I'm talking about? There was a little scandal at, in the New York Times a few weeks ago when there was an article that ran that quoted one writer saying something kind of nasty about another writer. And the author of the article had heard this remark, that she had said this remark to him when they were both at a conference together in Brazil or something, and they were just chatting behind the scenes at a conference where they were both giving presentations. And he, several months later, included her remark, which he'd remembered, in an article, which was very embarrassing for her because she didn't want to say something mean about this person in public. She just said it in a sort of casual way, and she was outraged. She was like, this was a casual conversation between fellow writers behind the scenes at a conference. This was not meant for publication, and he felt, well, I'm a journalist. She knew I was a journalist, so she should have known that I might quote her. Now, I am 100% on her side, but not everybody was. So this is something that people are debating right now. What should be the assumptions? But certainly, I believe that if you're going to be a journalist and you're going to quote people, that person always should know that that's what you're about. You should be always upfront. So anyway.
So you're being recorded.
I know. Thank you. I understand that now, but I think it's really good that you ask, which people don't always do.
But I also love that you're from the Ethics Center of Ethics, because that's a huge topic that we've talked about here. So we've talked about like the California law with recording, and it's a 1% approval. New York is 2, so
that's right.
The difference with that.
Yep.
Okay, back to you. Can you talk about your article?
Oh, yeah.
Because it's very cool. And
Thank
very
you.
long.
Oh, well, it's.
But we love that.
It's not so long for the New Yorkers.
In a good way.
So I came up with the idea because I had been looking. I mean, usually it's something that I've been thinking about, and then I go about finding a person or a group of people to through whom to examine a certain issue. But in this case, I was looking for. I had been living in this area for 6 months, and I was looking for a story that I could write that was local. And I was looking on the UC Berkeley website, and they had mention of one of these people, actually somebody who did not end up appearing in the final article, but whom I interviewed, about how he had been reading Shakespeare in prison and how it had sustained him, and he had then, after he was paroled, made it to UC Berkeley, and I thought that was extraordinary, and I wanted to know how he'd done it, and because I thought, well, if we could figure out like how someone can make, and he wasn't in just sort of, for a few months for some, a driving violation or something. I mean, he was in hardcore prison for many years. And as you saw in the article, these other guys also had, many of them been in solitary confinement for, over a decade, really hardcore prison, yet somehow they made it out. And so that was my interest. I wanted to know, how did they get from A to B? And one of the happy surprises for me in doing the research was, usually if you find some intractable, difficult societal issue, you can fight to rectify it, but you realize that it's going to be very, very, very hard. In this case, for once, that was not the case. The central key thing was already in existence and had been for 50 years, which is to say Pell Grants. The fact that if you apply to college, you are eligible for $5,000 in Pell Grant money, and then a further $9,000 in loans. And that's not a huge amount of money, but if you have just emerged from prison with a criminal record, your prospects for employment aren't so great, and that is actually decent money for you if you're living somewhere that's not too expensive. And in all of these cases of the people I interviewed, that's why they went to college. It wasn't like this great intellectual drive. It became an intellectual drive. Once they were there, it caught fire, and they loved the work, and they decided they went on. Many of them are thinking about careers in academia, but that's not what got them into college in the first place. It's because that Pell Grant was the best financial prospect they had. They just needed the cash. And how great that this thing is already there. And so all they need to do, there's other things that need to happen, but is let people know while they're still in prison, this is available to you. Start thinking about it. This is a possibility that you should think about, and you're not ineligible just because you have a felony on your record. So that was one of the exciting things to me, is the solution's already here, which is rarely the case.
Do you guys have any questions about the article? I know a lot of you had really good questions.
I do, Ms. Baxter.
Okay,
Don't
go
mind me
ahead.
immediately chime in.
Go for it.
I kind of wanted to draw a parallel with your story, and with the story I wrote that I took too much time on. Yeah, I took too much time on it. But what I think, this deeper level story. You said you wanted a local story, right? And so we have the prisons and all that, and I think that's such a broad story that can reflect so many different perspectives across the nation, even across the world. And what I had a problem with in my story, which was just about, transportation of kids living in a lower income neighborhood to here, which is far away, and that brought me to entirely different places, just a huge scope where it did turn into a national thing with, how much money the federal government is willing to pay. And so to connect that to my question is how did you manage, and did you manage to find the root problem and really incorporate it into your story? Because just with that little story that I did, the root problem was so much bigger. And so with this, big subject, I'm wondering, where was the root problem? How big was it? How did you manage to?
Well, can you tell me more about that? Like, what did you go into the story thinking it would be about, and then how did you? It sounds like it changed in the course of your reporting. So can you tell me more?
So throughout my research, I remember I told Ms. Beischer about this. I remember one night, I was just up until 3 a.m. on a school night, just like going through tons and tons of just financial manuscripts that were on the website of the school district, and I just kept on seeing, where this money was going and how it was, and then I looked at other articles, other opinions, and I just kept seeing like, oh, so there's a trend, there's a problem. I wrote a side note. I'm not going to read that out loud, but basically I saw this. It evolved from a story about how lower income kids, coming from a lower income neighborhood, for the chance of having a better education, have to be bused 45 minutes to a school like this, and how that's a problem. And that was my whole, those were the parameters around my story. But it wasn't just that. The reason it took so long for me to finish was because it was more than just transportation. It was money, it was what people were willing to do, and it was the pursuit of good education. Did I make sense? Did that kind of reel it back in?
Yeah. And so the problem was not that there is not free available transportation, but that it's, I'm maybe projecting here, that the problem is that it's necessary to go that far to get a good education from certain neighborhoods. Is that? Yeah,
and yes, it's necessary to do that, but it was also, it's a problem. Like it's broken. There are faults with it, and that was what I was trying to talk about. And when I discovered that, to fix the problem, you would have to invest a lot more than what people were willing to do. And so to bring that back to your story, I was wondering, did you find something similar? Was there a fault or something wrong with the prison system, and did that connect to a national scope of things?
Well, there's many things wrong with the prison system, but that was not that's a vast subject. I wasn't writing about that. I mean, I guess to me, this was actually, it's true that much of journalism is about a problem, and what is the potential solution? What are the potential barriers to that solution ever happening? That's a common structure, as it should be. That's a big part of the role of journalism. This piece was not quite of that structure. This was more like, here's a solution you didn't even know existed. You maybe thought there was just a problem and you hadn't even thought, because I think to many of the people I heard from who read it, and certainly to me personally when I heard about the existence of this group, because remember, my starting point was it was just this one guy.
Right.
And then I discovered there's this whole group of people in the same position, was that there was this possibility that I hadn't imagined. I mean, when you read about the criminal justice system, usually you're reading about problems farther behind, as it were. Like you're reading about unbelievably lengthy sentences for nonviolent offenses. You're reading about over-policing of certain communities. You're reading about all of that stuff. What you never read about is the hopeful possibility at the other end that actually, even if someone has been in prison for decades in the most miserable surroundings possible, which do break some people, like solitary confinement, it is still possible to emerge and be not just a functional member of society, but an extraordinary member of society. And I guess if you want to think about it in terms of problem, I mean, Joni and I have been putting together a panel discussion that we're going to have tomorrow with a group of people who, in different capacities, work to help currently and formerly incarcerated people get an education. And one of the things we're going to talk about is, it's ironic, it's not here's the problem, what's the solution, it's here's the solution, now who objects to it? Because some people find it galling that, it's hard to get into UC Berkeley, as I'm sure you all know, and are thinking about. And some people find it galling that here are these formerly incarcerated people who are, most of them not 18 years old. They may be in their mid-40s, and they have been imprisoned for certain crimes. And some people think, well, why should they get these incredibly valuable taxpayer-supported spots? And there's a movement to help people, not just formerly incarcerated people, but people inside prison get a good education and help them get a BA. And there's been resistance from some guards, from some corrections officers saying, wait a minute, why should they get a free or subsidized college education? I didn't get that. That's not fair. So it's a slightly different structure from the problem structure that you're describing, but it does bring up some interesting issues. Another issue that I didn't know was an issue until I started discussing this with Joni and with a colleague of hers at Stanford, is there's also some question of, let's suppose that there are limited resources and you can offer an education to some people in prison but not others because you have only so much time, only so many professors, etc. Do you give those spots to younger prisoners who are going to get out, let's say within the next 5 years, and then will need to get a job, and thereby exclude people who are older or who are going to be in prison maybe for life? Should it be like pragmatic like that it should be offered, this valuable thing should be offered to someone who can make use of it in an obvious practical way, getting a better job? Or is education a basic human good that shouldn't be withheld from people, even if they can't use it for a material end? So those are some of the questions that people have.
Just to respond to that really quickly, I really liked your response to my question. It took the answer that I was, thank you, basically.
You're welcome.
but I'm starting to see a trend which is almost like it all kind of boils down to education almost, right? And I was wondering, what are your thoughts on that? Is that too general, or is that what have you seen in your years of meeting people and of writing stories and research as a journalist?
Well, I mean, I don't think if you're saying it all boils down to education, I think education is incredibly valuable, but I don't think that if you don't have an education, you are not. I mean, you can have just as considered an opinion and just as valuable a life if you don't have it. I mean, I'm not quite sure what you're
No,
asking.
that's fine. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to say that, like, if you don't have a college education,
Yeah.
forget it.
Yeah.
It's certainly not.
Thank you, Larissa. Thank you.
I have another question regarding the building a prison to school type.
Yeah.
I noticed that all the interviews that you included in your story were of formerly incarcerated
Mm-hmm.
people. Did you interview any police officers or jail guards while doing the story, or like someone involved in like who's guarding the prisoners?
I didn't. I mean, I read a lot about it. I read, in particular, a really interesting book by a journalist named Ted Conover. Gosh, I'm forgetting the title of the book, but he is. There are certain journalists who are not content with just interviewing people. They want to really get to know a subject from the inside in a very deep way, and they just go above and beyond what regular journalists do. And Ted Conover is one such person. So what he did was he really wanted to know. He'd heard a lot about the bad blood and the violence between prisoners and guards, and he didn't want to just say, oh, well, those guards are obviously horrible people. They must just be really violent people. Otherwise, why would they try to get those jobs or something like? He said, I want to see what it's really actually like. And so he took a job in Sing Sing, which is a prison in New York, just north of the city, for a year as a corrections officer. And he had to go through all the training, and it was a big thing. And then working there every single day for an entire year, and he found himself sympathizing with both sides. I mean, he saw definitely a lot of violence towards prisoners, but he also saw a lot of violence towards corrections officers and felt the fear that they felt, which often was the cause of the violence, and felt the resentment and the, all kinds of emotions that he didn't expect to feel. And it was a really, it was an extraordinary book. So anyway, I read that book and I read some other books, but the focus of the piece was narrower. Again, like it wasn't about the prison system. I mean, part of journalism or any kind of writing is obviously defining a subject that is focused, not so narrow that it's uninteresting, but narrow enough that you can really focus on one thing. And for my purposes, my question in this piece was how I was focused on this group of people, the underground scholars, and my question was, how did they manage it? How did they get from A, solitary confinement in Pelican Bay Shoe, to B, a spot at one of the most selective universities in the country? That was the question I wanted to answer. And so if I'd been asking another question like, how did they deal with solitary confinement and why was it so hard, I would have wanted to get a sense of that, and that would have involved interviewing people in the prison for sure. But for the question I wanted to ask, which was a different question, I didn't think that was necessary. But if I'd been writing, I mean, as I said, like we've been talking about these other questions to do with guards sometimes resenting the fact that prisoners are offered educational opportunities that they themselves did not have. If I were writing a story about that, then obviously I should interview the people. Yeah, the people who felt that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
What is your technique for interviewing people?
It's funny. People often say, well, how did you get so-and-so to say this or that? How did you get them to trust you? I mean, I don't know how you all I mean, it's interesting because it's something you maybe don't do as often when you're in school, have conversations with total strangers where you don't know anything about them. It's not something that you do all the time, but after school you do more, and it's you find that it's actually not that hard people want to talk to you. There's no special tricks other than asking questions and listening. If you're really interested, some people don't, and then you don't interview them. If they don't want to talk to you, then that's fine. But most people want to. I mean, it's interesting. Last year I taught a writing class at Stanford, and one of my students who was a sophomore, they all had to, one of their assignments was they had to write a profile of somebody, and I said it could be anyone, it just had to be someone they didn't know. And she picked somebody, actually a fellow student, but one she didn't know. And she used it, as I was saying earlier, like it was an excuse to talk to this person. She was intrigued by this person. She didn't know him, but she wanted to find out what his deal was, because she said he was always angry. He was always furious, and she wanted to know what was behind that. But she'd never had the guts to ask him, but now she had an excuse. So she did, and she just sat and listened, and it turned out he had a lot to say. And she went away from that not only feeling like she had gained an understanding of this particular person, but she told me, from now on, I'm going to behave differently when I meet someone. She said she had felt sort of awkward and shy when she met people, and if there was any silence, it would make her very nervous. And so she would just start talking nervously to fill the silence in an effort to make everything more comfortable. And she realized that she could actually tolerate silence, that it was okay to ask a question, and then maybe the person wouldn't speak immediately. And she shouldn't just jump right in. No, she should just wait. And she said, I'm going to do that in regular conversations. Just ask people about themselves rather than chattering about myself always, and see what happens. And I don't know, that made me very happy, because I think that's like maybe the most valuable thing you can learn in an interview, is how to ask people questions and listen to them. Because not everyone does that.
I just want to say, like, you don't have to spend very much time with Larissa, but also, I mean, the listening part seems really important, because whenever we have people around and then sort of afterwards we're discussing amongst ourselves, there's a way that you can tell she's listening to what your answer was, in a way that you feel like she cared about it and wanted to hear it and wasn't waiting for you to just get done so she could ask you what the next question was. And I think in the end you say things you were surprised you said. In a way, just sort of it's a natural way, and I don't think that's something that everybody either knows how to do right from the get-go or is their personality, but I think it is something you could learn. But yeah, we talk about that all the time, that you have a way of making people feel very comfortable very quickly, and then they're engaging with you, and not everybody has that.
Well, I think it's partly just knowing that I think people want to talk to you. Like this student, it's not like she was some big egotist who wanted to talk about herself all the time. The reason she did it was out of nervousness, and she didn't know that people would want to talk to her, especially people older. You know, another person she interviewed in our class was a professor, and she thought, why would a professor talk to me? Why would a professor give the time of day to me, a student? And then she discovered that, oh, they were happy to talk to her because she was asking good questions and she was genuinely interested and wanted to know. And that was kind of a revelation. And that's, I mean, the reason I think that people just don't always know that is because people ask me, how do you get people to talk to you? And I'm like, it's not a trick. It's not, there's no trick. You just ask. And if they say you don't want to talk, that's okay too. I mean, when you guys do I know not everyone here is a writer. Some people are photographers and some people are editors, but everyone writes. Okay. So do they do assignments that involve interviewing people?
Every assignment.
Oh, okay. So do you go, I don't know, I mean, the problem for you guys probably is time. You probably have to do them very quickly, but do you go in generally with a list of questions, or do you have enough time that you can let the conversation develop? And also, how do you take notes? Do you write it down, or do you use a tape recorder? Like, what's your technique? Does anyone want to? Yeah.
What I do is I go in with a list of questions, or like if I know I have more time, I'll just like go in with one or two questions, and then I'll let the conversation go from there. Like any questions that may like develop from the conversation, and then I generally record it on my phone and then use that.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And how much time do you usually allow for an interview?
Maybe about 15 minutes.
Right.
Sometimes shorter if I don't have much to ask them.
Right. I mean, of course, it depends on what role the person is playing in your story. Like, if the point of the story is like an in-depth piece about one person, you'll probably talk to them for longer. And if it's just like you just need to get an answer to a particular question, that's different.
Yeah.
But I mean, another thing that one thing, I mean, this is not really a trick, but it's something I have found is that sheer time makes a huge difference. Just staying there. And again, you don't always need that from somebody. It depends what role they play in your story. But I have a friend who is is a corporate interviewer, and I'll spare you the details of exactly what she does, but suffice to say, she interviews people for 5 hours. For 5 hours. And they don't take breaks, they just sit together for 5 hours. And it's almost like she's an interrogator. It's a little sinister. But things happen in time that cannot possibly happen in 10 or 15 minutes. And so I encourage all of you, if you have the time, which you don't always, and if that's the point, is to really get to know somebody, just time makes a huge difference. Like resisting the temptation to be like, well, I'm done with my questions. I guess we should go. If you just sit there. Yeah.
Sorry, is it okay if I switch back gears to?
Of course.
Switch gears back to the article.
Yeah.
So I noticed a lot in the article, especially through the interviews, that it seemed like all these students, these former inmates, drew a clear distinction between themselves and kind of the students who were younger than them, who had not been to prison, and they kind of seemed to associate kind of the younger students as being somewhat more naive, maybe a little bit more idealistic, because they hadn't seen what they had seen. My first question is that true, or was that just me, or did you guys see that too, or did you see that too? And B, how did you keep yourself from from them associating you with these students as kind of this person who wouldn't be able to understand their problems, who wouldn't be able to to whom they wouldn't be able to speak about this?
That's a good question. I mean, because in some ways I was more like them, because they were more my age. But in other ways, I haven't been to prison, so you're quite right. But that was kind of the premise of our conversation, was that I didn't understand. That's why I'd come to them, to ask them for help and understanding. And the other premise was that they wanted people to understand. They wanted it to be known, both what their experience was like and what it took to get from A to B for them, but also their larger mission was to get people to understand that they were not aberrations, that this is something that could be perfectly possible. This is something that could happen far more often, that people would leave prison and end up getting a great university education and going on to do amazing things. This is something, it was interesting because it was almost as like a sort of self-undermining interview, because they would tell me their stories, but then they would also say, but it's not about my story. On the one hand, I understand that's a necessary way that people are going to understand where I'm coming from. On the other hand, if you tell my story, there's the risk that I will sound like an exceptional individual, but I really need people to understand that it's not about me. So many of them contested my starting question. If you remember, like my question was, how did they do this? And I did come in with the assumption, which I then was corrected, with that these were exceptional individuals, that this was very unusual. And it is statistically unusual, but they corrected me and they said, no, it's not about us being exceptional individuals. We're not. We can tell you, we know, we were there, and we know that there are many people in prison who are just as smart and just as able as we are. Their problem is that they're still in prison. That's why they're not in college. And so it was a tricky thing because and some people who one man in the group said, I don't want to be in this article because I think it's unavoidable that you telling my story will put me up on some kind of pedestal as an exceptional person and undermine my political goal, which is to get rid of that idea and to promote the idea that this should be normal. So that was a tricky part of it. But yeah, I mean, they definitely thought that they were less naive, but it wasn't like a snobbiness. I mean, you know, it's sort of incontestable that someone who's 45 and has spent 20 years in prison knows certain things that an 18-year-old right out of high school is not going to know. It's not the 18-year-old's fault, but it's just the fact, right? And, you know, I mean, there isn't anyone 20 years younger than you, but like if, you know, someday there will be someone 20 years younger than you, and you will find them pretty young. So I if it came off, and there was some snootiness in the sense that, you know, they did get frustrated in class with people saying, well, this is the way the world works, this is the way the world works, and they're like, they have no idea, they haven't lived in the world. So there was an element of frustration there, but I don't know. I mean, tell me more about did you find that annoying that they were sort of looking down on the students?
No, I didn't feel that like they were looking down on them. I just felt like they saw it how it was. They saw that these kids were obviously much more inexperienced. They had seen, you know, these people the former inmates had seen the world that they were discussing firsthand.
Right.
And then the students were just discussing based off of what they had read in a textbook.
Right. Right.
So I thought that was cool.
It's true, though. I mean, on the other hand, I mean, they get frustrated with people who they felt were saying things that weren't true. On the other hand, when Underground Scholars started and they had their first meetings, a lot of the people who showed up to the meetings had not been to prison. They were just people who wanted to help, and they were welcomed. And, you know, a lot of those people were very helpful to the Underground Scholars in the early stages because they knew how to work in the university. They were like, okay, if you want to get a grant for, this is who you need to talk to. And if you want office space for this group, this is a place you could apply. And, you know, they just knew the mechanics of how to get a group and an activism going. And that was totally helpful. So it's not like they were keeping people out.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
Everyone's so nice to thank me for. Yeah.
Was there a certain stage of your career when you struggled with ethics, or did you never find it a problem?
That's an interesting question. So well, you said you discussed ethics. I mean, nothing comes to mind, but can you tell me like some of the things that you've discussed in this class? What kinds of things you were thinking of?
Just like slander and libel, mainly those fields like corporations that can be talked down, or even people that can. We were looking at the case of JonBenet Ramsey,
Mm-hmm.
and how NBC, I think, recently made a show, and the son of the JonBenet Ramsey case is now suing the show for defamation. And I found that really interesting, how something like 15 years later they brought it back up. So yeah, I just wanted to know if ethics, like in those fields, if you ever struggled with that, right?
I've never had anything, thank goodness, like a defamation suit or anything. I mean, the closest I can think of to that is sort of interesting. So I wrote a piece about a young girl, and her parents loved the portrait of the young girl, but the father was annoyed with my portrait of the mom. And he wrote a letter, he didn't sue us or anything, but he wrote us a letter saying that he was annoyed by it. And it was very striking to me because I felt like he made a mistake that is totally understandable and a lot of people make, but I think is a mistake, which is he felt that I should have I portrayed her as a human being with flaws like all the rest of us, and he felt that was insulting. And I wrote back to him and I said, if you portray someone as a perfect person, it doesn't work. It's unconvincing. It makes the reader suspicious of you, the writer, and it makes you suspicious of the person written about. It came up also with another piece I did, and again, this wasn't a matter of complaint or lawsuit or anything, but I was writing a piece about Caroline Kennedy, who, she has JFK's daughter, and for a brief period, she was running for Senate in New York, and then she withdrew. But while she was running for Senate, she had always been very, very private and didn't want anyone writing about her. And her friends were very careful never to talk about her because that was just it was so important to her and had been the rule for her whole life. But then she was running for Senate, so suddenly all that had to change. She had to talk to the press, and the press wanted to talk to her friends as well. And so she gave certain friends permission to talk to her, and interviewing these people was hilarious because one of them would say, she's Einstein, and then he would say, no, she's not Einstein, she's Newton and Einstein, and she's Mother Teresa. No, she's Mother Teresa and Jesus. And like the praise was so crazy and over the top, and because they had never talked about her like a human being, and they didn't know how, and they were very, very nervous of offending her. And finally, to one of them, I said, look, stop. Not only is this gonna, if I quote you, not only are you gonna look like a jerk and no one's gonna believe you, she is going to look like a jerk, because it's gonna sound like she is someone with no real friends, who people, either they don't know her at all, or she's like some kind of weird dictator who's forbidden them from saying anything. She doesn't sound like a human being. She sounds like somebody with a dictatorial press. It just doesn't work. And I tried to explain this to the father also, and I wrote him a letter explaining, like, if I'd represented her as some weird, perfect mom, she would have come off very badly. That's not why people, why people have affection for others is not because they're perfect, but because they aren't perfect. And I explained this to him, and he wrote back, and he's like, oh, okay, that makes sense to me, actually. It's hard, because if you read something about yourself and it's in the public, and you're not a celebrity, you're not used to being written about, it can be shocking if you hear yourself saying to your child, no, I don't care if you want to, I can't remember, it's a long time ago, but let's say she said, I don't care if you want to play games, you got to do your homework, and she sounded kind of mean or whatever. It was something like that. If there's nothing like that, it doesn't work. Anyway, so this is something that very few people understand, and obviously if it's you don't care about any of that. You want to just sound perfect. So it's difficult when you write about people. It's, I think, very different writing about people who are private citizens and people who are used to being written about. People who are used to being written about, you're not going to freak them out. And they know the game. They've been interviewed many times. They know what it feels like to be written about in public. They know how to say some things and not other things. But I feel like the ethical thing here is not so much avoiding defamation, though you should always try to do that. But there's also, I think, a sort of murkier ethical rule to protect people sometimes. I think if you're writing about a politician, there's no need to protect them. You should, if they say something unguarded and awful, you should report it, because that's part of your duty as a journalist. But if you're writing about someone who's a private citizen and they're doing you a favor to talk to you, and there's no, then you should think twice before saying something that will embarrass them, even if it's something they themselves said to you, knowing it was an interview. You're legally unimpeachable, but ethically, I think, you need to think further. So defamation, in a way, is the easier thing, because that gets into the legal realm. It's the sub-legal realm, I think, that gets kind of complicated. And you have to ask yourself also, like, what is the purpose of my piece? Like, does it justify hurting this person or harming their relationship with somebody else? Like, maybe they said something nasty about somebody, and that could destroy their relationship with them if you published it. Is it worth it? Legally, fine, no problem legally. But that's, do you know what I mean?
Right. Oh yeah.
I don't know if have any of you come across that kind of thing where someone's, and also the tempting thing is, because when someone says something nasty, it's often fun. It will make the article really lively if someone's really nasty. So it's a temptation.
Want to share? Well, I don't know if you guys have heard about, like, we had a protest last semester at Woodside. After Trump was elected, we had like a fight at campus, and then the following day, two students. A fight, yeah. And then the following day, two students organized like a protest.
Of Trump or of the fight? Okay.
Well, that's what was told to us, like the students, when I interviewed them. But the way it was portrayed in the news was a very different light, and the way the fight was portrayed was a very different light. And so then I wrote the story about how it was portrayed from the news and how like the students felt about it and how it like affected us and like the community, because it depicted Woodside in a very negative way, how we weren't like respecting of everyone's beliefs and everything, which was completely false and it was not what actually happened. And I struggled with, like, I had to call the news station. I called them like multiple times, left messages, and they never got back to me. And so I just like wrote in my article that they had no comment, but I reached out to them. But then like after I published it, like then they were calling me and talking to me. But it was just, for me, it was hard because like that was my lead, was like how they wrote about Woodside and how it was like false. They did like a bad job reporting. But like without their interview, like I felt like it wasn't appropriately covered, even though like I felt like it needed to be covered because
Wait,
Woodside,
you've lost me. What was not appropriately covered?
the story that was done by Cron 4 and like ABC7, and like talking to the people who like ran the event or like the sit-in, their goal was also kind of twisted by like some of the faculty members that were talking at the event, which was hard for them too, because like originally they just wanted to be at brunch and lunch, but it ran through like fourth period, so like a lot of the students missed fourth period, and just some of the messages that were said at the sit-in, like that's not what they were trying to say and everything. But I just felt like my article lost like not credibility but lost information because I wasn't able to like comment from Cron 4.
But to the point of a nasty interview, the news was not friendly to you.
No, yeah.
Right?
The news,
Cron 4, when they replied with a comment, were very aggressive.
What did they say?
When I was like interviewing them, because I called them multiple times and I was like passed around, put on hold, and like I'll get back to you tomorrow. And then I had like one woman just be like, "We're never gonna comment on this." And then they were just very like passive aggressive, which I mean like I understand, like you're getting like backlash from the community about like a local story you did, but like I feel like in that sense it's like unfair to like do that to me, like I'm just a reporter.
But did you feel that there was anything wrong with your initial story?
I mean, I feel like obviously like I was calling them out for doing a bad job because they depicted Woodside in a negative way, and it wasn't necessarily the fact that like it was a fight, it was the fact that there was no like not backward information, but they didn't reach out to like the other side of the party of the fight, and they just covered it like completely in a negative light and wrong after talking to people who like organized it and the students in general.
Who organized the protest.
Yeah, who organized the protest. And I think like obviously like no one wants to be called out, but if like you're being called out, you might as well just like talk to me and not have me write you didn't want to comment.
Well, they should have returned your call for sure, but what do you feel that they did wrong in the reporting? What should they have done that they didn't
I think
do?
a lot of, I don't know if they can comment if they want.
And this is not just your opinion, but it's the organizers of the protest opinion. This news article
Who were
sparked.
interviewed.
Yeah, and I think like the issue was that there was a fight that took place and on campus, and like that's its own issue. But when they covered the story, the girl who was interviewed, she and her mother both said that she was beat up because she was like supporting Trump, and that was the sole reason. When there was a lot of like background information and a lot of other things that took place prior to the incident, and then so that was also really negative because it made Woodside seem like we don't accept people. And then when we had the sit-in the following day, it became more of like a anti-Trump protest, where when I talked to people who like organized the sit-in, it wasn't meant to be that. It was just equal treatment amongst students, and not to have one student get like expelled and one student have no punishments for saying like hate speech on the internet. And that was hard for me too, to find the angle. But I think, I mean, I'd be upset if anyone called me out for doing a bad reporting job, but I just felt like it was very difficult and they weren't making it like any easier for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the difficulty is, it does sound like they did a slanted job, and you know they did it too quickly. But I mean, I guess the thing is to always be open to the fact that things are not what they seem. I mean, you know, like with the story that you read, the prison story. When I read the story on the UC Berkeley website that made me want to pursue it, it was about how great it was that this guy was reading Shakespeare in prison, and you know that sounds like, well, look how great, how wonderful, totally unambiguous. And then I start talking to him and I realize, oh, you know why he was reading Shakespeare in prison? Because it was a signed reading from his like neo-Nazi fellow inmates, and it was like Shakespeare was, along with other Western texts, was designed to promote white supremacy. And I was like, wow, that wasn't in the UC Berkeley promo story. How interesting. And so, you know, I guess the lesson seems to be like, no matter how obvious the story is and how 100% clear, the message seems to be, you can always get beneath it and find something else. Not always, but, you know, sometimes. And again, I think the thing is time. I mean, those guys probably didn't spend very much time here, right?
They didn't.
And, you know, sometimes you can't help it. You know, like, I have a luxury of time because I write for a magazine. So I don't know if, I think some of you are thinking about journalism as a career. If you are, one of the things to think about is time. There are fun things about being a daily reporter, either for TV or newspapers. It gets your adrenaline flowing and you report things very quickly and you're finished, and at the end of the day you turn it in, you're done. If you write for a magazine, you can get deeper into something and you have the luxury of making mistakes and getting things wrong and then correcting them before you've written your story because you kept at it. But you're, you know, stuck in the same piece for months, which it's fine to me, but a lot of people get dragged down by that. So that's something you can find out about yourself probably in college when you're writing longer things and you decide whether it's something you enjoy or something that drives you crazy. Yeah.
Okay, so a question I had, this isn't about the prison article, it's about, I think, article you did about West Virginia and like the Trump stuff there. I was wondering like what steps you took to research about areas that like have experienced widespread social political change before like coming to do interviews. So
well, so I think what you might be referring to is West Virginia. I did a story about Trump voters in West Virginia last summer because it was the most Trump supporting state of the entire country. But one of the interesting things about West Virginia is that it was a solid blue, well, they didn't call it blue back then, but solid Democratic state for 150 years until 2000. It had never voted Republican ever since Andrew Jackson until 2000. And then probably because Al Gore was an environmentalist and West Virginia is the economy of West Virginia is very dependent on coal. And he was opposed to coal mining because of environmental reasons. They voted against him, and they've been Republican ever since. But to me, again, one of the interesting things of that situation was, again, you should never look at something on the surface and think, oh, this is the way it is. Well, actually, no, it was very, very different relatively recently. Why is that? What happened? And certainly environmentalism and opposition to environmentalism is part of it, but there are lots of reasons. Is that, I mean, I'm not quite sure if that's what you were asking about.
That was like around the response like I was looking for, towards, because I was like, West Virginia didn't experience it like as much as other states, as much as other states that like kind of had like a Trump wave. I was just wondering like, in general, like the steps you take to like kind of get yourself more familiar with how the societies have changed. You brought up a good example with like the Gore thing, where like the environmentalism and how it's been like Republican since. So.
Are you asking how does she do most of her background research?
Also that too, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely read a lot before I went. But again, this is back to what I was saying before, like, I read, I think, 3 or 4 books about the history of West Virginia before I went there. That was a joy to me, but a lot of journalists, that would not be fun. That would seem like homework and not fun. So again, that insofar as you're thinking about journalism, you want to know, like, do you like to be incredibly well prepared and get really deeply into something before you go interview somebody, or do you like to just, plunge right in and just, because, much of the coverage during the election was journalists writing for daily papers, just flying in there and just finding people literally on the street. You have a few hours to write a story. I had a friend who graduated from college and he went to work for the New York Times on the business desk, because that in those days maybe still was where you often went when you were just a new reporter. and they said, we need you to write a story about something to do with derivatives. And he said, what's a derivative? And they said, find out and have the story in 5 hours. And he did. And my first thought was, oh my God, like this stuff that I'm trusting in the New York Times is written by my friend who knows nothing whatsoever about what he's talking about and had 5 hours to write it. How can you trust anything in the Times? But he probably did a pretty good job because he's a really smart guy, and you can, if you call up the right people, you can find out a lot in a few hours. And he loved that. And so it can be really fun just having to just talk to people, and not everyone will talk to you, so you move on and you find somebody else who will talk to you and you move on, and that can be a very exciting way to report.
You're like out of breath by the end of the day.
Literally, yeah.
That's how I felt. Yeah, I was
Or
like shaking.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
But actually, like last class, if you guys, they put out a story in an hour.
So
An
scary.
hour? What was it about?
It was
We
really
did-
fast.
We had like we had like an event about, it was like belonging and like coming back. It was like the day after break we started, and we had like an organized for all the 7th period classes. We had to fill out like, I am like Latino and I am prouder. I am an immigrant and I am proud. Like different things like that saying, and then they had like a giant mosaic of it, and that said WHS, and then it basically just like belonging and like talking about like how we're a community and how we all belong, we all have a place here. But we didn't do like a written story, we did like an audio package. So
But
like
you had to write the script.
Yeah, Liv wrote the script, and then like I interviewed our principal, and then you interviewed
Another teacher.
yeah another teacher, and then I talked to a student. But yeah, it was stressful. But it was
How
okay.
could you have done that in an hour? I don't even understand.
Because it was during lunch, like was the event, and then
Yeah.
we came to class and finished it.
They edited it and wrote it in an hour.
Wow.
Isn't that fast? I was very impressed.
And how did you feel afterwards? Were you glad that it was
No,
so short?
I was happy that it was done, but like when Miss Spicer told us that, she's like, "Oh yeah, this is due today," and I was like, "Okay, we'll see what happens at 3:10."
But it's funny because if you push yourself, you can get things
Yeah.
done so
Yeah,
quickly.
That's true.
You can.
I
You
think
can.
it like depends on the story, because that was a very like easy. Like it wasn't like anything was like deep happening. It wasn't like a controversy. It just was like reporting what happened at lunch.
And it's becoming easier, I think, to do stories quickly, even stories where you haven't had time to go to the place, because, I mean, in events like war or unrest, often all you have to do is find out the right Twitter accounts, and people are tweeting just their experience from, I mean, a few years back, there was a political movement in Tahrir Square in Cairo, in Egypt. I don't know if any of you watched that on television, but reporters were getting a lot of information. They were looking at the scenes on television, and they could see the square, and they could see crowds milling around. And then they could look on their computers, and people were tweeting from all over the square, and they would say, I'm in the northwest corner, and I can see tanks coming down here, or I'm in the southeast corner, and there's a fight going on between X and Y, and it's an amazing thing. There are all kinds of different ways to report very, very quickly, but again, it's not always. Some people love that. Some people get an adrenaline rush and like being an ER doctor, but it's not for everyone. Could you? I'd love to hear about some of the other stories you've written, like the stories you're most proud of or were most interested by.
So when I asked the question about the ethics, I did an article on Black Lives Matter in the Bay Area, and I interviewed a police officer in San Francisco. And when I interviewed him, he said that he personally had not seen like any police brutality whatsoever in his 8 years of service. And after I was done with the interview, I wasn't sure if I should include that in the article, because another person I interviewed was the sister of a lady who was taken into police custody alive, and then the next day she was dead in custody.
In San Francisco.
Yes, in Oakland actually.
Okay.
And so I had heard in the article as well. So when I interviewed him, I wasn't sure if I should put that in, because it was kind of two opposite sides. And I called him up the next day and asked him if he wanted me to include that part, and he said no. So he didn't want that part.
Because you told him, I'm also going to include this in the article.
I gave him the entire backstory of. So that was like one point when I struggled with ethics, I wasn't sure whether to ask him if I should put it in or just include it.
That was very decent of you. A lot of journalists would not have done that. I think that was very decent of you because a lot of journalists would have just put that quote in and made him look like a jerk, either an idiot or a jerk. And it also pertains to something that I think journalists are talking with each other about more and more now since the election. Is there used to be this sort of norm in journalism that you should not so much in magazines slightly, but definitely in newspapers, that you should be objective. You should try to be balanced, and that meant getting quotes from both sides. And people are questioning that now and saying, well, if, sometimes there are two sides to the story and you want to present them both, and that's the way to do a story. But in other cases, one side is right and one side is wrong. And is it the right thing to do to be objective by presenting, well, A says this and B says that, and then stop? Or is it your job as a journalist to say, A says this and B says that, but B is lying, or B doesn't know what he's talking about, or something like that, And that's even before you start thinking about B's feelings. So I think you're touching on a really, really important point, because I think the norm of just presenting two sides and then throwing up your hands is eroding. People are starting to see that's just not responsible for journalists to do that. And you could easily have done that. You could have said, well, on the other side, there's another opinion, but you didn't. And I think that was the right thing to do.
Thank you.
But I can understand why it would be difficult. I'd love to hear about any other stories someone's done that you're proud of.
Not so much my story, but more about what you said is, how do you know, to kind of be the bigger person, and how do you, make your mark? I don't know how to phrase this, but basically just, how do you try and be the best journalist that you can be? Because I feel like there's a lot of journalists out there who try and just take the negative side of things and stick to that. How do you kind of balance that out? Just, I don't know how to phrase that.
I think it depends what the truth of the matter is. I mean, sometimes the negative aspect is the case, and that's what the story needs to be about. I mean, in the case of this policeman, maybe he said that because he was just ignorant, or in another story, I mean, it sounds like you were very decent to him in this case, but I can imagine in another situation, what if he'd been the chief of police, and he was just trying to cover up things that were happening in his department? Then the right decision might have been to be negative and to let him hang out to dry and show everyone that he's saying this thing that's just not the case. So it's not like being positive is always the right thing, right? I mean, it can feel good to be nice to everyone, but that's not always what you should do. I mean, is this something that you've confronted? Decision you've had to make?
It kind of popped in my brain just now.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was just wondering about that.
I mean, sometimes it's difficult because, these TV journalists, I can imagine. I don't know. I have no idea what they were thinking, but it may be that some people in their office were like, "Gosh, do we really want to run a story where we're being nasty to a bunch of kids? Is that really what we want to do? Maybe you shouldn't run mean stories about kids in high school, but and then other people would want to say, well, no, it's important to expose what they saw as nastiness, even if it's in a school. So, and I can see both sides of that.
Can't tell if your hand is up or not. Kind of up.
Yeah.
It's sort of up.
In your story, you had what I found to be a very interesting tone of how it was very at some points in between quotes, it almost seemed conversational, where you're speaking to the reader, and is maybe it's because I'm just not used to reading kind of these longer articles that take a long time to build and have different style and structure than the articles that we usually write. But how did you choose kind of the tone with which you wanted to write your article? did you want it? How did you choose whether or not you wanted to be formal or informal or all of that? Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that because you all are writing for a newspaper, and so there's certain requirements. I mean, one of the things, again, like the difference between different kinds of journalism. So if you're writing for a newspaper, you're writing for a reader who generally is impatient. They want to know what your story is about, because they want to know in the first 2 sentences what the story is about and whether or not they need to read it. And then if they're interested, or if they feel like they need to read it, they'll go further down. But you gotta tell them right away, because you have to imagine your reader is maybe, well, this is in New York, I guess no one is doing that here, but riding to work on a subway, and they need to read the paper quickly.
Here.
It's the morning, on the phone, right, exactly. Hopefully not while they're driving, but anyway, while they're busy, and they just, you need to get on with it. The nice thing about magazines, and especially the New Yorker, is that you're dealing with a reader in a very different kind of mood. It might be the same person, but I like to think that it's usually in the afternoon or in the evening. They're done with work. Now they're ready to give you some time. They're not reading a New Yorker article because they think they need that information that day. They're doing it for a different reason. They're doing it because they want to learn about something they didn't know about, maybe something they really don't need to know about, but they're interested. And they trust a particular magazine because they've read it for a while, and they know, okay, I didn't think I was interested in formerly incarcerated students, but I like this magazine, so I'm going to give it a chance. And that gives you the freedom to take your time getting into a story. I mean, in this case, I told you what it was about very quickly, but you don't have to, which is kind of fun. It gives you some formal leeway. You don't have to have the theme of the story in the first paragraph. You don't immediately need to tell the reader what it's about. You can draw them in slowly in a kind of oblique way if you want to. And in terms of the tone, you also have a lot of freedom. Like, again, in the newspaper, there's a certain newspaper style which is required. It's partly that it's very simple. You want the language to be very simple because, again, you're dealing with a reader who wants you to get on with it and get the information across as clearly and simply and quickly as possible, for the most part. Whereas in a magazine, again, you can choose. So in this case, I chose a more conversational style because often I want to make it sound not literally as though the person I'm writing about is writing it, but kind of like as though it's in their voice rather than mine, because the article is about them. So obviously I'm writing about several people in this article, and they are very different from each other. But and part of this happens without my intending it. Partly, I'll be writing about somebody and I'll be hearing their voice because I also tape record interviews. And so you've been listening to them and hearing them again, and that it sort of comes out in your writing. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of reading a book and then you have to write something and you find yourself writing in the manner of the author. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I find that can be a very useful thing if the author is a really great one, to try on other voices for size. And sometimes that it doesn't work, and sometimes it does. But that's what I find myself doing with the voices of interviewees. Do you tape record people when you? And do you find? I mean, again, it's probably too time consuming to do at length, but I find it very interesting to listen to people very closely on a tape recorder, because often what you think they said is not exactly what they actually said, and having a recorder is like really the only way to detect that, because people speak too quickly to get it exactly right, taking notes. Which is not to say you should always record. Sometimes you do not have time for that, but
and it lets you focus more on the person you're interviewing.
Absolutely. And it lets you look at them in the face, and in the eyes. I mean, if you're going like that, it's very difficult to have a good conversation. You can do it, but I think it's harder.
Yeah.
I'm surprised you all record. Do you all record your interviews?
Unfortunately, I still take notes.
Well, that's much more efficient. I mean, recording and then listening to it again is much. I mean, I'm surprised, just because if you're writing a newspaper article, you're probably very pressed for time.
Well, I actually switched at like some point, because we had an audio project like November or something, and that's when I really started using the recording device. Because like I realized, oh, it's like a lot more efficient to like talk with them and like have an actual conversation with them. But before I took notes, and like I found it's been a lot faster just taking notes, but I found like I can't get everything because they talk too fast, or like the conversation shifts or something like that, so I miss stuff. But then like I've seen that there's advantages to both.
Yeah, absolutely. You definitely miss stuff though. If you have the time, it's great to record, because then you're thinking about what the next question, and you're thinking about how much time you have, and you're thinking about, you know, whether and you just you can't write fast enough. You miss a lot.
Yep.
You miss a lot.
What is your what is the article that you're most proud of, and why?
I don't know. That's a sweet question. I guess one article I was proud of is in 2007. I had the great privilege of interviewing Obama when he was a candidate, and what I was proud of is that I felt like people were not listening to what he was saying, and I think it's still true in the exact same way. People, especially people on the left, were thinking he must be, actually people on the left and the right were assuming he must be a very left-wing guy, partly because he's a community organizer, partly because he's black. Like, I think people made all these assumptions, like his politics must be this, and his politics were not that. In fact, what he kept saying over and over again as a candidate was, I want to bring people together. I want to change the way politics is done in this country. I want to end partisan fighting constantly. I want, to get ideas from everyone. I want to have a conversation. And that's not the kind of thing that someone who's way out on one side or the other says. And I think people heard that, and they heard it, but they thought, he's just saying that, like everyone says that. But I think it was actually very important to him. Now, this did not happen, mind you. He did not succeed in bringing everyone together, as you may have noticed. But I think it was important to him. And so what I tried to do was show how he was really a political mixture. He was, for instance, on several issues like healthcare, running to the right of Hillary Clinton, who was then his opponent in the primary, and that he was just he was not exactly what people thought he was. And I guess several friends of mine who are more conservative said that they voted for him based on that article, because they had also assumed, he must be some wild lefty. And that inspired them to read his book, his first book, which I encourage you all to read. It's a fantastic book. He's a really terrific writer. It's called Dreams from My Father. It's about his growing up. It ends about the time I think he goes to, well, he wrote it when he was very young. He wrote it right after law school. And I think that, as I recall, that book ended, I know when it ended. It ended when he married Michelle. So it ended when he was, I guess, in around 30. But it's a really beautiful book. He's a really fantastic writer. But if you read it also, you get the sense, like, here's someone who is just a mixture of things, and a very, very thoughtful person. And I felt like, insofar as I contributed a little bit to showing that to people who weren't listening to him, I felt good about that. You had your hand up before. Go ahead.
You had a question earlier, Christian. I can wait.
Okay. I know before you worked for the New Yorker, you were working for other publication companies. And did you find, like, working for New Yorker more intimidating than those other companies you worked for?
I guess it should have been, but it was more intimidating, but I was a bit older, so, why do you ask? That's an interesting question.
Just because New Yorker is such a respected magazine, I would imagine working from there, even if I was working for other companies before, I would be quite intimidated working there.
I guess, partly because I was writing for them at first. I was in graduate school, so I wasn't in the office, so it was not the normal thing where you walk in and you're the new person. Like, I wasn't even there. So, and by the time I moved back to New York and started working in the office, I'd been there for a long time, so maybe that was the difference. But also, I feel like one of the nice things about working there is it's a very friendly, very genial office. Like, people really like each other, and it's not, I mean, not every office is like that. It's not very it doesn't feel very competitive, partly because it's not as structured. Like in a newspaper, you usually have your beat. Several people have a particular beat. Like, you might write about law, or you might write about medicine, or you might write about poverty, or whatever it is. And you're going to have other people on that same beat, and they're all competing with each other. And so sometimes a newspaper, in order to get the best possible thing, will send 5 reporters to the scene of some big event that's unfolding, and only one of them is going to get their article in. That does not foster very warm relationships with your colleagues. You can understand why they do it. They want the best article, and they know that they have one day or less than a day to do it. So, but it makes for a very cutthroat kind of atmosphere. Whereas the New Yorker is sort of more random. Like, people don't tend to have beats. People do. It feels like there's enough room for everybody. So it's a nice place, and it's actually one of the things that I didn't know when I was in school that would be nice about working is, like, for instance, the day after the election, a lot of people were very upset, and everyone came into the office, and we sort of gathered and watched television. There's a big screen in the conference room where we all gathered together and just sort of talked about it together and absorbed it, and it was a very nice thing. And not all offices function like that, but it was. So yeah, it's a good place to be. I feel like people really respect each other there.
Are you watching the, I don't know what your time is?
We're okay. We have about 5 more minutes.
I know this is a really general question, but I just wanted to ask you, you think that there's such thing as an unbiased news source?
That's such a good question. That takes maybe an hour to think about. I mean, what do you think?
For example, I think that the coverage of the election was very opinion-based. Like, it was more to fulfill an agenda.
Like, can you give me an example?
Wondering if there's any news sources that at least you found that don't really seem to be based on opinion, more of proven facts. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that there's no such thing as a person who's totally objective. Everyone has their point of view, and it affects the way you see proven facts, right? I mean,
yeah,
and also which facts seem to you to be the most important facts.
Yeah, and most news is based on perception, and because of that, I think that's why there might not be a such thing as a unbiased news source.
I mean, it depends what your standard for unbiased is, right? Like, if you mean by that a human with absolutely no views, then you're right, there's no such thing. But I think journalists try really hard to be fair, even if they have their own opinions. And interestingly, one of the people who understands this is Steve Bannon. I don't know if you guys know who he is. You know who he is? He's one of Trump's right-hand men, and he, I forget the name of his title at the White House now, but he used to run Breitbart, which is an alt-right news website, and he is now, and he's very influential in the Trump campaign. And at some point he was interviewed, and he said, you know, I used to think that the news was inevitably liberally biased because most journalists vote Democratic. And he said, then I realized that while it's true that most journalists do vote Democratic, that's not all that drives their coverage. What drives their coverage is what drives most people in the professional world, which is ambition. And so if you give them a juicy story that undermines their candidate, they're going to go for it. So actually, I mean, on the one hand, it makes it seem like news is more objective. On the other hand, it means that journalists are actually, when people say journalists are biased, they're giving them more credit for being more idealistic than they in fact are. The suggestion is, well, they believe in X and Y, therefore they would never write anything that would undermine X and Y. That's actually not true. They will totally undermine X and Y if it's going to, help their career. Not in every case, but often journalists are driven by the good story rather than it's really not Pravda. It's really not people thinking, okay, what is going to help our side? We will do only that and not other things. It's much less organized and ideologically driven than that. That said, everyone does have their point of view. So it's not as simple as, in some cases it's as simple as, I'm going to cover up these facts and give these fake facts because that will help my cause. Sometimes people are doing that. But much more often it's more subtle than that. It's not, I'm going to cover up the reality and promote falsity. It's, this is reality, and that is how reality looks to me. But I don't see other aspects of reality that are also true because I have a certain view of the world. Does that make sense? You're looking puzzled.
Yeah. I'm just kind of focusing on what you're saying.
I mean, I think it's important to talk to people with different points of view. I think that's because often, we've talked about this earlier in this class, like you can be completely convinced that you're being very truthful. You're being 100% sincere, 100% truthful, reporting on the facts, and yet you can at the same time be missing a huge part of the story that would totally change your opinion if you knew it. And so I think it's not enough to be dedicated to reporting the truth. You have to also be constantly trying to make sure that you're not just getting one tiny distorted sliver of the truth because you haven't been talking to people who see things differently.
That was a deep question, and I think we're out of time. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
It was really great. You were wonderful. So thank you.
Well, thank
I
you.
think we all learned a lot. Just a little bit. So thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes. Yes, that would be awesome. Hey guys, hold
Christian.
on. 1 second. Before we leave, they will walk you back so you don't get lost.
Okay, thank you.
So, Friday, your final draft is due by the end of class. Not for this story. For story number 1 for the semester. Okay? So if you haven't, Olivia, have you copy edited everyone's rough draft?
No, do you want me to?
Yep. I thought that was happening over the weekend. Cool.
Oh.
Thanks, Olivia. And then this story, you will start working on the rough draft next class as well. So you're doing double duty. Great. Put the desks back. Thank you.
What we're doing,
Christian. I don't know how to pause it. I don't know how to stop it. Because I don't know how to pause it.